The Electoral College, that thing you hear about every 4 years when it comes time to elect the President of the United States. On election night, you'll see news anchors stand at interactive screens zooming in and out of every precinct in the nation, discussing the current results and what they mean. Then they'll start calling states, and after most of the states are called, there will normally be a candidate with at least 270 electoral votes. They will be deemed the winner. In the days after, you'll inevitably see maps that look like these. And people will be talking about their theories on why the winner was the winner and why the loser lost. In the coming weeks, the final tally of the popular vote should be settled. At this time, it's either business as usual if the winner has the most popular votes as well as the most electoral votes, or the losing side flames up in anger because their candidate received more votes from the people, yet isn't the president-elect. Regardless of the scenario, discussion of the Electoral College will fade after the president is sworn in on January 20th. Because hey, new presidents are interesting. Well, it has been a couple of months now, so I think it's time to spark this conversation back up and really examine the Electoral College for what it is and why we have it. In order to discuss something as historic and traditional as the Electoral College, we have to look at its roots. As with much of the United States government, the Electoral College was molded during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. From May 5th to September 17th, the group of men we now refer to as the Founding Fathers discussed and debated what would end up being the Constitution for the budding new nation. When it came to electing the president, the final agreed upon plan was to give each state an amount of votes equal to the number of senators and representatives in their state. After the election, whoever had won more than half the votes in the Electoral College would become the next president. Today, this system manifests itself as 538 electoral votes spread across 50 states and Washington, D.C. After the November election, whichever candidate has 270 votes is crowned the winner. As Alexander Hamilton expressed of the Electoral College in Federalist 68, "I venture somewhat further, and hesitate not to affirm, that if the manner of it be not perfect, it is at least excellent." But was it? Since when discussing the merits of the Electoral College, there is almost always an argument of, well, it's what the founders intended. So it is important to look at the actual discussion and debate that brought about the Electoral College. By the time the founders started having real discussions on how to elect the president, most of the Constitution had been debated and decided. They settled on having a government with a judiciary, a legislature with 2 houses, and a president with checks and balances running between the 3. This came about from the Connecticut Compromise, which was comprised of parts of the Virginia and New Jersey plans. From this, we have the House of Representatives, which awards states representation based on the size of the state with a minimum of 1 representative, and the Senate awards each state 2 representatives regardless the size of the state. While the Virginia and New Jersey plans differed, they did agree on how to elect the president. Their solution was to have the president elected by Congress. Yes, Congress, not the people. Later, it was agreed upon that it would be for 1 term of 7 years. Much different from what it is now. So if this was the original plan, how did the founders get to the Electoral College? Well, the founders had essentially 3 schools of thought when it came to electing the president. The first prevailing idea was, as mentioned before, to have Congress elect the president. The argument was that the people elected their congressmen to represent their interests, so those representatives would know how to best vote for their constituents. This would be akin to how the United Kingdom elects its prime minister. The people vote for members of parliament, and then those members vote for their prime minister. This would be almost unthinkable in America today. But when the Constitution was being debated, most state governors weren't even elected by the people, but were elected by the state legislatures. So this is not an outlandish plan. Speaking of state legislatures, they were at the core of the second school of thought, some sort of state-based election of the president. At that point in history, federalism played a very large part in American governance. The United States wasn't a country made up of small territorial governments under one unifying government, but was essentially a group of 13 semi-sovereign states that acted like independent countries and loosely associated with each other. Some election ideas were for the state legislatures to vote on behalf of the state and its people. There was also a plan that was voted on that would have had the governors of each state be the sole voters in the presidential election. Again, we see these as crazy ideas in today's world, but the founders were fond of indirect elections, systems where it's not the people who decide, but the people decide who decides in one way or another. But not the last group, no. The last group were fans of direct elections, where everyone votes and their votes all count equally. Whichever candidate has the most votes wins. Winner takes all. Those who proposed this, including James Madison, saw political equality as a key virtue. Since the president is one representative for the whole nation, everyone should get an equal say in the election. While those in favor of the direct election were smaller than the other factions, the idea was still well represented amongst the Founding Fathers. But the other two factions weren't fans of direct elections for 3 reasons. First, the United States was a relatively large country and it was 1787. The fastest form of communication was a man on the back of a horse. So it's a reasonable concern that information about presidential candidates wouldn't reach the long distances across the country effectively and the people wouldn't be able to make adequately informed decisions. The second concern was that the people would only pick candidates from their own states. This is another testament to how powerful states were in the beginning of the nation. Today, at most, a candidate may expect a small boost in their home state if they are still popular by the time of the presidential election. So this is simply not a concern in today's elections. Lastly, it was feared that the people would be swayed by a few designing men, or in other words, con men. The founders were concerned these men would easily trick the populace with promises that weren't possible, but the people wouldn't know any better. At the time, there was nowhere near the amount of news and information that we have today, with the cutting edge of information back then coming from newspapers and pamphlets. Note here that none of these concerns was the fear of the majority. Proponents of the Electoral College will often argue that it was designed to protect against the tyranny of the majority. This fear was considered in other parts of the Constitution, especially when pertaining to the operation of Congress, but not for the election of the president. The founders hoped that a candidate would have broad support when elected president, not the support of a select minority. While there are many instances in the Constitution where minorities can stop an action, the founders ended up creating a system where a minority can take an action. So with 3 potential systems for electing the president and a list of common fears, it was time to find common ground. What resulted was the Electoral College, a compromise between the proponents of direct elections and of state-based election mechanisms. The people would participate in popular elections in their states, and then state legislatures would decide how to allocate their electors. These electors would then go on to truly elect the president. So how does this solve the concerns that the Founding Fathers had? What ultimately sold the Electoral College was the office of the presidential elector, an elected office with one singular purpose: voting for the president. It was the intention of the Founding Fathers that electors would be the smartest, wisest, and most dignified people of the state so that they may be able to adequately use their ability as a faithless elector effectively. But wait, aren't the electors supposed to vote the way the state voted? No. Electors are faithless, which means they have the ability to vote however they wish. Yes, really. They can vote however they want. In the 2016 election, there were 7 faithless electors. While some states have laws penalizing electors for voting out of line, the constitutionality of these penalties isn't clear and have never once been issued. So in reality, they can essentially vote how they want. And faithless electors are not seen as a major feature of the Electoral College in the modern age, but they were the major selling point for the founders. It helped mitigate the concerns the founders had. If the people of a state voted on bad information, the electors would theoretically have the most up-to-date information when they arrived in their respective state capitals and would be able to make a responsible decision on behalf of the people. So check that concern off. The Electoral College also has a rule that an elector can only vote for one person from their state between their votes for president and vice president, ensuring that electors wouldn't just vote for candidates from their own state. Check. And if these electors are the most intelligent in the state, they would be able to see through the tricks of a con man and protect the citizens of their state from a bad vote. All concerns are covered. This system checks out. So that's what the founders intended with the Electoral College. It was an 18th century solution to 18th century problems. While there weren't many writings on the Electoral College, almost all praised the use of faithless electors, and almost none mentioned the merits of awarding smaller states outsized influence in electing the president, which is often a core argument of modern proponents of the Electoral College. So when it came time to ratify the Constitution, there was a much smaller discussion on the Electoral College than there was on other parts of the Constitution, such as the structure of the government and protection of rights. This lack of conversation led Hamilton to also say in Federalist 68, The mode of appointment of the Chief Magistrate of the United States is almost the only part of the system of any consequence which has escaped without severe censure, or which has received the slightest mark of approbation from its opponents. But there is also a good reason why the debate was largely non-existent. From the very beginning, it had been the assumption that George Washington was going to be the president, regardless of what mechanism got him there. So it wasn't a huge deal at the time of creation, because Washington was going to be president no matter what. That, along with much more contentious issues about the Constitution, such as being too strong or too weak or not guaranteeing rights, the debate on the Electoral College was minimal, and it went on to elect George Washington and many more men to the office of the President of the United States. So after 58 presidential elections over the course of nearly 250 years, how does the Electoral College stack up? Firstly, we are the last country in the world to use an Electoral College. While other countries used similar systems in the past, they all eventually went away during times of political turmoil, at times caused by the Electoral College used in those countries. That doesn't mean we have to get rid of it just because of that, but it's always peculiar when a country is the last still doing something. Secondly, with the larger and more apparent issue, it is possible to win the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. It happened just recently in the 2016 election, with Hillary Clinton earning nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but Trump earned 306 electoral votes while Clinton only earned 232 votes. This is the fourth, or fifth according to who you talk to, time the winner of the Electoral College lost the popular vote. Now, most of the time when it comes to discussing the differences in electoral vote versus the popular vote, there will be a heavy emphasis on mathematical calculations, such as that a voter in Wyoming has about the same voting power as 4 Californians. While that is true, it's hard to feel that as individuals, even though it is a big difference. Each vote counts for so little to begin with that we can't feel how it affects the bigger picture. What we should look at is concrete examples of how flimsy Electoral College victories can be if you look a little closer at the results. Instead of looking at the popular vote for the entire country, we will look at state popular votes, which are what inevitably determine the composition of the Electoral College. And not just any states, the states where the winner won by a small margin. For the 2016 presidential election, these states were Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Between these 3 states, Clinton lost by a combined total of 77,744 votes. If she had closed that gap and gotten one more vote in each state, she would have been the winner in the Electoral College. These are the votes that ultimately decided the victory for Trump. Votes that are equal to roughly 0.6% of the votes cast in those states and 0.5% of all votes cast. While I respect the people of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, why did they ultimately have the power to elect the president, say over the 4 million more people who voted for Clinton over Trump in California? Are the people in these states more important? As circumstance came to stand, yes. These people were instrumental in Trump's Electoral College victory. Would it have mattered if Clinton won 2 million more votes in the states she did win? Nope. These 77,744 votes are what decided the election. And this is not an uncommon occurrence. It often happens behind the veil of the total popular vote and the electoral vote preoccupying everyone's attention. There have been 19 presidential elections where a shift of less than 100,000 votes in specific states would have completely changed the outcome of the election, making the other candidate the electoral winner, but the popular vote loser. And in an additional 7 elections, a shift of 25,000 votes or less between a couple states would have resulted in no winner in the Electoral College, and would have sent the election to the House of Representatives for deciding, which is a whole nother topic that I won't be able to get to in this video. So that is 26 elections, or 45% of all presidential elections decided by a really small amount of voters in a few states. While most use extreme arguments of why the Electoral College is broken, there are concrete examples that show that winning in the Electoral College can amount to some luck in just the right places. But then there will be some who say, well, they campaigned in just the right places and got the votes right where they needed them. But did they? Why should an election come down to a small group of voters that, by the circumstance of where they live, have the ability to decide the entire election? What makes a Michigander's vote more important than those of Californians, or Texans, or the people of Kansas, just because those are states that choose who they want for president by large margins? Speaking of states that choose their candidate by large margins, campaigning. A common argument is that the Electoral College makes candidates focus on the states and protects the interests of small states. Well, in 2016, 39 states received 3 or less presidential campaign visits, and 25 of those received no campaign visits at all. 2/3 of all campaign visits happen in just 6 states: Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, and Michigan. And why all the campaigning there? Are these people any different or any more special than the rest of the voters? For one reason alone, presidential candidates campaign in these so-called swing states, and that's because the voting population is split down the middle on which candidate, or arguably party, they favor. Since the state could go either way, candidates have incentives to campaign there, and not in places where they are sure to win or lose. 5 of those heavily campaigned states in 2016 are in the top 10 of most populated states, and if we stretch that out to the top 12, all 6 are included. None of these are small states. In fact, some of the smallest states, such as Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, Montana, Rhode Island, Hawaii, Idaho, and West Virginia, all received 0 campaign visits. Only one small state had any noticeable amount of campaigning, and that was New Hampshire with 21 visits. But New Hampshire certainly doesn't represent all the small states. And in the modern era, most small states west of the Appalachians vote Republican, and those on the East Coast vote Democratic, consistently. This gives little incentive for candidates to campaign in those states. Neither did they campaign in California, New York, Texas, or Illinois. All big states, but are not campaigned in the modern era because they are considered safe states for their respective parties. And with safe states comes the discussion of speaking as a state. In the current system, the winner of the popular vote in 48 states and DC is awarded all of that state's electoral votes. Because states speak as one, right? Well, in the 2016 election, 30% of Californians voted for Trump despite the state being heralded as the land of the liberalist liberals. Trump earned nothing despite all of those votes because of the winner-take-all system. In Texas, the "I won't have my daughter dating a damn liberal" state, Clinton won 43% of the vote, yet got nothing, and those Texans' votes ended up not mattering for anything. Actually, every vote that isn't for the winner of a state means nothing. There is only the consolation prize that it adds to the popular vote totals, which may or may not align with the electoral vote. So by now, if you're still with me, you may be thinking, well, with all those problems, what can we do to better elect the president? If so, the next part of the video is for you. But if you're thinking, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, the Electoral College is perfect, well, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe write an angry comment or something, I don't know. But let's talk alternatives. The most obvious would be a winner-take-all direct election, where everyone votes and all votes are counted equally. While I personally see this as the best solution, I don't think this is what reform efforts should focus on. The problem being that nearly 250 years of tradition has built up, and it would be a near political impossibility to change to a popular vote, and especially now. Dislike of the Electoral College used to be a nonpartisan issue, with roughly 60% of Americans wanting a straight popular vote in the 60s. But the Electoral College has become a partisan issue after the 2016 election, so there is little hope to get a straight popular vote. So instead of abolishing the Electoral College, we should reform it. With either of these next 2 plans, I would propose that the office of the elector should be abolished, and electoral votes should be awarded automatically. Given enough elections, the outcome of one will be determined by faithless electors making their own decisions. While it has never happened, there were 7 faithless electors in 2016, similar to all the faithless electors in the 20th century. We don't need a group of relatively unknown people making decisions for all the voters. We can figure things out on our own in the 21st century. And also the House contingency election thing. We have better modern solutions to remedy that. Again, not enough time to really talk about it, but you really don't want it. The first Electoral College reform plan is called the District Plan, which is already being used in Maine and Nebraska. This allocates an electoral vote to the winner of each congressional district. Since Nebraska has 3 representatives, the winner in each district earns an electoral vote, with the remaining 2 electoral votes from the senators going to the candidate that won the statewide popular vote. This would better represent the people, but would not make elections more competitive. Thanks to redrawing of district lines in recent years, the average margin of victory for a House representative in 2016 was 37%, meaning that on average the winner won by having 37% more votes than the loser. That's a lot and not very competitive. If this were to be transposed to presidential elections, almost all districts would be decided before the campaign even started. Instead of having battleground states, there would be battleground districts, an even narrower field and less representative of the interests of the nation as a whole. So while I see this as better than the Electoral College as it is today, I don't believe it is the solution to work towards. The second solution, and the one I believe would be the best solution in the current political climate, is the proportional system. Under this system, each state would award its electoral votes in proportion to the amount of votes each candidate won. People's votes are still weighted the same, but everyone's vote would matter. Currently, in my home state of Illinois, it is assumed that the Democratic candidate will win. So in the 2016 election, as with many elections before, the Democrat got all of our electoral votes, which at the moment is 20 votes. I know Republicans and Democrats who don't see the point in voting, because all the electoral votes will go to the Democrat regardless. But if in the 2016 election there was a proportional system, Clinton would have still won, but this time with only 11 electoral votes. Trump would have won 8, and the last electoral vote would have been given to Gary Johnson, the third-party candidate. All told, if the system was proportional in the 2016 election, Trump would have had 264 votes, Clinton would have received 263 votes, Gary Johnson would have 9 votes, and Jill Stein and Evan McMullin would both have 1 vote. Now I hear you say, wouldn't that make it harder for a candidate to reach 270 votes, the number needed? To remedy that, we would introduce an alternative vote system, where voters would rank the candidates as they like them. When there isn't a winner in the Electoral College, each state would be instructed to take the votes of the biggest losers and award those votes to the voters' second choices, and so on until there are only 2 candidates and a clear winner. But Erthely, you'll say, what if there is a tie of 269 votes to 269 votes? What will we do then? My solution is to add 3 more electoral votes to the system. Who would get these votes though? These would go to Americans that don't live in a state, but in American territories. These people are American citizens, and yet they don't get to vote for president. Americans living abroad even get to vote in the state they last lived in. So these votes would go to the citizens of Puerto Rico, Guam, the US Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands, which have a combined population of roughly 4 million people. This would bring the total number of electoral votes to 541. Sorry, Nate Silver and your website and stuff. With an odd number, it would take 271 electoral votes to win, and it would not be possible to have a tie with all votes going to 2 candidates. While I think that is the best solution in the current climate, it is important to remember that any election system will have legitimate problems. There is no perfect voting system that will satisfy everyone, but that doesn't mean we can't look forward to improve and better how we elect our politicians, and in this case, the President of the United States. The Electoral College needs an update, and the debate needs to be well informed and thoroughly discussed with the best information available, and not with feelings and calls to tradition. America is a grand experiment, so maybe we could experiment a little. And there you have it. While there is a great deal of information and argument packed into this video, I couldn't fit everything in without this becoming a feature-length film. I will have lists of my sources on my website, link in the description. And since this is the internet, the next step is the conversation. Pop a comment below wherever you found this video, and have a nice discussion, please. It is possible to have differing opinions and have good discussion. And if you like this video and want to see more in the future, consider contributing to my Patreon. My hope is to make videos with as much nuance and clarification of talking points as I can, and to hopefully better the public discourse about different topics. Thanks for watching.